For our E3 video, as I've already said, I am by no means an expert. My foray into E3s is a total fanboy. So we thought something a little bit different. We would get in a bona fide E expert. So this is Mr. Tony Wilkes, and he is the E3 register keeper for the BMW Car Club of Great Britain. So I suppose one of the things I'm always really interested in are BMW stories. There was a series of things that BMW put out called BMW Stories, and it was all about, you know, people's personal connections with certain cars, and there were great artistic bits of cinematography. So yeah, I suppose what is your connection? How did you get interested in E3s?
Well, thanks for the really kind introduction, Steve. So expert is one word, maybe geek is another word when it comes to E3s.
Then we're in good company.
Absolutely. So I think my BMW story started, I remember as a little boy, going to a local dealer with my father, and we were just waiting, and I have this very vivid memory. In the workshop of this particular dealer was an Arctic Blue E3 3.3 Li.
Oh, cool.
Which, you know, was, even at the time, you know, clearly it's a very long time ago, was a rare and unusual car. It was only 222 right-hand drive 3.3 Lis. So, you know, it was a rare car, you know, even when it was new. But I remember being utterly struck by that car, by, you know, the wonderful, as you know, I love Arctic Blue. You know,
Yep.
It's a wonderful colour, and I think probably the best colour for an E3. But it really rich black leather interior. It was on 7-inch Mala BBS alloy wheels and Michelin XWX tires. I remember it vividly. You know, and it made such an incredible impression. And I think it was the, you know, the aggressive nature of that, you know, that stereotypical quad headlight, sharp nose front.
Yes.
And it just, the car's presence, it was just phenomenal, and it etched itself in my memory, you know, without a shadow of a doubt.
Clearly. That is, as you say, a vivid recollection.
Yeah.
So how kind of far did you go? So that you were 7 then, did you say?
Oh yeah, I'd be about that sort of age, yeah.
So then, obviously, that, were you always keen? Did it go away for a while and then come back? Did you kind of see one day, or was it like 17 years old, got to find me an E3?
No, I think so I've always loved classic cars, you know, and I think since I could read, literally since I could read, you know, I hoovered up, you know, my father's classic car magazines, because, you know, he's into cars as well. So I do remember, it would have been the mid-80s, that there was an article on E3s, and so this is a few years on from, you know, what we talked about initially. I remember hoovering that up, and again, I was just struck by, you know, a car that was introduced in 1968, but the technology, you know, that was in that car, you know, really groundbreaking stuff. So, you know, all-round disc brakes, you know, on the larger cars was vented discs,
Yeah.
all-round independent suspension, you know, and there was a whole load of other features. I remember that particular time being really struck. So I think sort of fast forward into sort of my car owning years, funnily enough, the first BMW I had was an E21.
Right.
So it was a Schwarz black, you know, it wasn't metallic, 323i.
Yeah, cool car. Very
it
cool
was
car.
really cool, and I hadn't realised at the time, because it was quite a late car. Had the Recaro seats,
Right.
13-inch Alpina wheels, had an Alpina steering wheel. But, you know, I think I paid £200 or £300 for it.
Yeah.
It was at that time when
Yeah.
it was just a sort of, and that was a fabulous little car. Absolutely loved it. And then I moved into E30s. So I genuinely couldn't tell you how many E30s I've owned, but there's a lot.
It's a dreadful disease.
Yeah.
No car guy has just one.
Yeah.
No, it's always many.
I could probably try and remember the number plates, and I still have an E30 to this day. I can't imagine life without an E30. But I got into E3s probably about 20 years ago. That I bought my first one,
Okay.
which was a Ceylon Gold 3-litre SI.
That would be on my list of colours that I would love, as a Ceylon Gold one.
It was a really cool one with a black leather interior, and it was a really early car, so that was 1972 in a K, so a very early right-hand drive 3-litre SI. And it, you know, it was, again, typical of the time. It had lived a bit of a life. I remember when I got it, it was on Wilkes race alloy wheels, so very sort of 70s modification.
Oh, okay, I know what you mean. Yeah.
So then I sold that car. And then I had another Ceylon Gold's E3, which is a 2500 automatic.
Yeah.
An amazing black velour interior. And that was a bit of a project car, and I must admit I bought it and didn't really do anything with, and then sold that on. And then I found the car that I have now that, you know, I absolutely love, which is a very, very late January 1977 3-litre SI. So production finished in February of 77. So it's within, I think it's within 20 chassis numbers of the very last.
The very last one.
Yeah,
wow.
So being a very late car, it's on L-Jetronic. So unlike the early SIs, which were on D-Jetronic, it's an L-Jet car, so much smoother, and it's a lovely, lovely thing.
So before we get into the techie stuff, which I do want to kind of ask questions about, you know, E3s are not common. You know, you don't see many of them around. Yeah. It was interesting actually when we were driving around with, so the majority of this film was filmed in Stratford-upon-Avon, and we were driving around and the car, and it's a busy tourist town, but the car drew a lot of positive attention, even from people who sort of clearly aren't car people. And I know, you know, that's probably fair because it's a 70s car. It's very different looking, and in a fairly affluent town where maybe it's not unusual to see interesting cars. Maybe this just piqued people's interests. So, but one of the things that interests me, I suppose, is the social, or is the backdrop to how and why the E3 came along. The social context of BMW, and BMW at that time, you know, as you say, it's very technologically advanced. Who bought these cars?
It's a really interesting question. So I think if we sort of go back in time and sort of refresh our knowledge of history. So, you know, we think to the 1950s and you know, what BMW was producing, it was the big V8 saloon cars that were very, very expensive, and that was very much BMW's focus at the time.
And unsuccessful.
And we've got to remember that that nearly made them, you know, go under, and that nearly finished, you know, BMW as a manufacturer, nearly went bust. And so the Neue Klasse, you know, in the early 60s, which evolved into the O2, which actually morphed into the 3 Series in 1975, that was the car that saved BMW. So we sort of take that through the late 50s, and with the bubble cars as well, which, you know, very much kept things afloat. So with the Neue Klasse, and BMW realising actually we're still pretty good at this, you know, this car manufacturing lark, they sort of get their confidence back. And so when the E3 was introduced in 1968, alongside the E9 Coupe, the E3 Saloon was the automotive equivalent of parking a tank on Mercedes-Benz's front lawn.
Yes.
Because we're, you know, the message was, right, Mercedes, you think you're good at the big saloon thing, you know, have a bit of this. And so with the 2500 and 2800, so BMW said, right, you know, the big 6, you know, and that's what it was called. You know, it was the big saloon.
It was the first car to use the M30.
That's right. So the M30 engine was designed and introduced with the E3 and the E9, and so, you know, that engine went all the way through to the mid 1990s. You know, a phenomenal engine that spawned so many different variations. So. And it was very much a resurgence of, we're back into the big saloon market, but also the sporting saloon market. So the demographic of buyer, you compare a BMW E3 buyer and a Mercedes, at that point it was the W114 saloon, W108, 109 having just been sort of phased out at that point. You know, very different dynamics. So perhaps the Mercedes buyer, perhaps an older, more mature sort of demographic, whereas BMW were appealing to the younger, sort of sportier type demographic. So those Series 1 cars, so 1968 introduced in Germany, and then 1969 introduced in the UK. Interestingly, we've got to remember in the late 1960s that it's only really, 25 years since the end of the Second World War.
Yes.
So in the UK, still perhaps a bit of a prejudice
against German things,
you know, things manufactured in Germany. So those people who are buying those cars had to be very well off. Let's not forget that in 1971, when the 3-litre SI was introduced, that it cost twice as much as a Rover P6 3.5 V8.
Wow.
Now, at the time in the early 70s in the UK, if you were a Rover P6 V8 buyer, you were doing very well in life. It was a sort of bank manager's car.
Surbiton address, that sort of thing.
Absolutely. So, you know, paying twice as much again for a saloon car. You had to really want one and be able to afford one.
Yeah.
It's also 50% more expensive than V12 Jaguar E-Type.
Goodness.
So if you were cruising about in a V12 Jaguar E-Type in the early 70s, clearly you were doing very well in life. So let's, and then you place that, the context of the time. So I think people who bought E3s, certainly in the UK, were very well to do, and clearly really wanted one, so understood what they were buying. And the other thing to bear in mind is that BMW in the UK was not the brand that it is today. So it's quite obscure, wasn't particularly well known, and was very much an enthusiast choice.
Yes. So I kind of imagine it was maybe engineers, or it must have been people who really appreciated how a car drove, how a car was put together, dynamics, and they're relatively. It's not that they're not luxurious, it's just that they are quite simple inside. I mean, in comparison to, say, I don't know, the only thing I can kind of really relate it to is I had a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow briefly, and which I know was the epitome of luxury, but yeah, there seems to be, it was definitely going for a kind of more modern finish, less I can't think of a better word than stuffy. But there you go, stuffy.
But I think that's a reason. I think that's probably quite an accurate way to describe it. Because, for example, if you were to place an E3 alongside a W116 S-Class from Mercedes, introduced in 1972, and again a hugely technologically advanced car that ended up with a 6.9, the 450 SEL, the really big one. That in terms of interior luxury and everything else, yes, very different cars. But then the way that those two cars drive, if you were to get out of an S-Class and get into an E3, particularly an SI, you think, these are very different, and there's a very, very much a sporting focus on the E3.
Yeah, I mean, I was absolutely blown away by how modern it felt to drive.
Yeah.
But in particular, the brakes.
Yeah.
The braking was phenomenal.
Yeah.
And I mean, Tom, the Supercharged Media, helps me make all these amazing little videos that we do. He had a brief go of it, and this is a person who's not kind of used to driving old cars. And even he said it was pretty much the first thing he said. He could not get over how good the brakes felt.
Oh, astonishing! And again, I talked earlier about the technology that was in those cars that fascinated me. So for the 3-litre cars, all-round vented disc brakes, 4-port calipers, and as you've experienced, if you've got to stop in a hurry, then goodness me, the braking power is phenomenal.
Yeah, on a 10p piece. I was blown away by how good it was. So I mean that's kind of really interesting. So essentially, you had to be a switched-on, driver-focused, and pretty wealthy person to take one of these, and I assume a leaning towards a modernist approach. One of our other clients sent me a really interesting article. His uncle and his aunt were both motoring journalists, and his aunt, something that probably going to get the details wrong now, but I'm sure it was the dealer principal or the guy responsible for importing cars into, might have been Switzerland or France, I'm not sure, but she drove a 2800 from somewhere in London to Paris after he'd made a comment about it being too far for a woman to drive by herself, or something, something period like that, and I guess that was a real kind of barometer of that kind of class and generation of people coming through, wanting to be more modern, and have the transport to go with it. Yeah,
absolutely. And so, as an example, my car, my 1977 SI, was owned by a titled first owner. Was a titled individual, and he had the car for many years, and only part exchange it in the late 1990s for an E34 M5 Touring.
Goodness.
So that gives you an idea of the individual and mindset and focus on quality of engineering, performance, and all those things that we recognise. You know, the sort of high watermark for BMW.
Now sort of standard, you know, terms that we throw around.
Yeah.
Regarding BMWs.
Yeah.
Okay, so that kind of effectively maybe doesn't start, but is really being demonstrated by the E3.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So, you know, the SI, which is the car that we've been tooling around in very pleasurably for the last couple of days, it's just getting to go, isn't it?
Yes.
You unlock it, you hop in, key goes in the ignition, fire it up, and off you go.
Yeah.
There's no, you know, no. It simply couldn't be any simpler, and that must have been revolutionary at that time.
Oh, absolutely. And if you consider that a 4-door, ostensibly a family saloon car, with a 200 brake horsepower, 3-litre fuel-injected 6-cylinder engine, and we talked about all-round independent suspension, limited slip diff was a factory option.
Yeah.
You know, the all-round vented disc brakes, 4-pot calipers. You could get into that car and just, so as an example. I think the longest single stint I've done in my car was from home down to Channel Tunnel, across, and then from Cali to Munich in one go.
Wow.
And do you know what? It was like driving a modern car. So, you know, got out at the end and felt that, you know, I'd been sitting in it for half an hour rather than however many hours it was. So that gives you an idea of the sort of car and what it was designed to do.
Yes.
And to do it in comfort. And so, you know, I think that's probably one of the really unique things now. So, you know, these cars are getting on for 50 years old, some of them are more than that, and yet you can still now get into one and do that sort of journey. Yeah.
I mean, I was staggered. The car that we've been driving around in has been off the road for many, many years. I know you know the car that we've done, its previous life and current owner. And you know, that car hadn't been on the road, as far as I remember, since the 90s.
Yeah.
And I hopped in it on a Friday afternoon, drove it home, did 350 miles in it after it hadn't been on the road for decades. And it did not miss a beat.
Yeah.
We had to adjust the idle, I think, whilst we were filming.
Yeah.
And and there was a few things that came, you know, they call it a 350-mile shakedown, which it was.
Yeah.
But, you know, the things that came of it were minor, and it didn't fail to start. It was over a 2-day shoot, and it just got better and better as we drove it, and I was quite staggered.
Yeah. And that's not an uncommon story for an E3, you know, the way that you just described that. And, you know, you mentioned about, you know, the car, so it's the one thing I would say, and it goes back to a point that you made earlier, that there are very, very few E3s. I think about 50 E3s left in the UK.
Wow.
And of that number, probably only about 10 or 15 are driven on a regular basis. So we're talking about a really rare car.
So the major downside of me making this video is I'm going to ruin my own chances of being able to get one.
Well, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
So let's talk about that then. So there are early and late cars.
Yes.
There are various things you've mentioned to me.
Yeah.
Very early cars didn't have certain bits of trim that ran down the side.
That's right.
The fuel-injected cars, there are D-Jetronic cars.
That's right.
Which are the early ones.
That's right.
And they made those from when till when?
So they were introduced in 1971, and then October 75 moved on to L-Jetronic. So that was the same time that the 3.3 Li, so the long wheelbase. The long wheelbase E3s are 100 millimeters longer than a standard one.
Yeah.
So October 75, that's when the 3-litre SI moved from D-Jet to L-Jet.
Yeah.
At the same time that the 3.3 Li was introduced.
So there's only 2 years of the L-Jet cars.
That's right.
Okay.
And I think, you know, this is just sort of my opinion. I think at that point, so an L-Jet SI is a sort of not quite as punchy, not quite as aggressive as a D-Jet car. And I think at that point, BMW at that point was sort of warming their buyers up, their customers up to the idea of what was going to come next, which is the E23 7 Series.
Yeah.
And so there's a few technical differences. So with the introduction of the L-Jetronic fuel injection on the SI, front anti-roll bar was slightly smaller. cars, just a little bit softer, not quite as aggressive as sporting punches the earlier cars.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah.
So often, like well, no, I won't use that analogy, but the rawer first album, shall we say?
Yeah.
But so is there a real advantage or disadvantage to having the D or the or the L-Jet, or are they just, they're different cars, they're the same car but with slightly different characteristics? One easier to look after than the other?
I think my advice, for anyone would be buy and condition rather than getting it into your mind. I really want a Digitronic, 3-liter SI, and then being absolutely fixed on that. So my advice would buy and condition.
Yeah. As with all classic cars.
Exactly.
Buy and condition.
As we know.
Yeah.
As we know. So that would be my advice, but then in terms of the characteristics of driving, I mean, like I said, the later cars are a little bit softer, the damper rate, the spring rates, and I mentioned the smaller anti-roll bar on the front, so slightly smoother, slightly softer, but really there isn't a huge amount. I think it's a characteristic of the fuel injection system, and I would suggest that probably L-Jet cars are probably a little bit easier to look after,
right?
Probably a bit smoother. D-Jet, as you know, can be a little bit more. I think you've got to know what you're doing to set a D-Jet car up properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, luckily we have that experience here, but even just the kind of warm-up cycle does feel it's incredibly impressive for what we were driving as like a 73 or 74 car. But in reality, having driven many L-Jet cars, the L-Jet is a smoother system, a more modern, a less noticeable system, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay, so finally, if people are watching this and thinking about, actually, I'm going to set my sights on an E3.
Yeah.
Community support, parts, other than obviously Classic Bahnstormers here to help with every every aspect of your ownership. But E3s, you will know better than most.
Yeah, so I think the community in the UK is pretty small. Like I said, there's only really 10 or 15 cars that use regularly of the approximately 50 that we think are left in the UK. So as a consequence of that, you've got a really small number. We all know each other really well, and it's really you've got to be an enthusiast, and you've got to really want to sort of be into E3s. And
it's going to be hard to buy a car that nobody else has owned, then apparently.
Well, exactly. But the good thing is, everyone sort of knows, that's so and so's car. That's a really nice car, and we saw in the history and everything else. And there's one chap who's a really passionate E3 owner. And it goes right back to his youth, when the cars were new. He tells me the story that a friend of his father's had one, and sort of took him and his friend out, and they went for a drive, and he was struck.
That's it. Solid.
Just incredible. And then so throughout, for many years, he's had some really lovely cars. So it's a lovely community. As you'd expect, very well connected with E3 Club in Germany, much larger membership base there, far more cars. As you'd expect there. So that for me is a really, it's a great relationship, and it's also a useful one, when it comes to trying to find things, more obscure and difficult to find parts and things like that. But on a personal level, on a friendship level, it's absolutely fabulous. And then, so I think one of the really useful things is, from a mechanical point of view, there are so many common components between E3s and E9s. E12s, E28s, believe it or not, E24s, E23s. There's a lot of common parts, as you well know, throughout that generation of cars. So from a mechanical point of view, there are a few things that are really hard to find, but actually generally, it's pretty good. And there's the usual suppliers of parts that we all know that generally, can find things. I think where it gets difficult is on some body panels. So believe it or not, some panels are still available new from BMW.
Good old BMW.
Believe clearly at a price.
Yes.
Some new old stock panels are still available from some of the well-known parts suppliers. Some, so like bonnets and boots, long since no longer available. And you're looking at a lot of money. If you find a new old stock bonnet, then you've done really well. You of course will pay handsomely for that.
Unicorn tier.
Yes, quite. Yeah, but believe it or not, things like rear doors you can still get new. Front doors harder to find. Rear doors for the long wheelbase cars really hard to find
Yeah.
because, of course, they're 100 millimeters longer.
Yeah.
Some interior trim you can still get new, some of the chrome trim around the car, aluminium trim, you can still get new bumpers and things like that. But some of the trim is impossible to find. So, for example, my own car, very late Series 3 car, the pattern of the fabric was unique to late August 76 to February 77 on the E3.
Word. Yeah.
And some colours of fabric, believe it or not, you can still get, some you just can't.
Yeah.
Some of the fabric shared with E12s of the similar period, but again, only for a very short period. I think 76, 78 on E12s. So things like that, you're in for a long haul if you want absolute originality. And unfortunately, I am cursed with this disease of wanting things to be
absolutely
it's
right.
absolutely got to be period correct, and I'm cursed with that, sadly. So.
Hey, it'd be boring if it was finished. If it was finished, you'd have nothing to do. So my final question for you is, something I've been pondering myself.
Yeah.
What would you say that the legacy of the E3 is to BMW? Like how if you look back in the history of BMW, what is the E3? Where does it sit?
I think, if we go back to the comment I made earlier about that very much that repositioning and reasserting BMW's position as a manufacturer of large saloon cars. So I said, taking on Mercedes-Benz directly and saying, right, you guys need to think again because this is what we've got. And so, starting at that point, that thread that went that then brought us to the E23 and the first 7 Series, and all the way through to the present day of the big BMW saloon car, which the 7 Series of today, clearly is very, very clearly. Positioned itself, although the BMW range has expanded so much over the last few decades. I think the other thing was reasserting BMW's position in motorsport. So this is something that we haven't talked about yet, actually, but we look at the O2. That was a hugely successful racing car.
Yeah.
We know all about E9s, the CSLs, how phenomenally successful they were, essentially spawned BMW Motorsports, and were continuing to win the German touring car championship years after they'd gone out of production.
Yeah, which is incredible, really.
Which in itself is a phenomenal achievement. But let's not forget that the E3 positioned BMW in the UK in saloon car racing, so the Group 1 3-litre SIs, driven by Roger Bell and Tony Lanfranchi. So, and did really, really well in Group 1 touring car racing, also in the Tour of Britain, the Avon Tour of Britain, which you probably remember from that time. So there's a really strong theme there, and I would argue that actually that then brought us to the position where with the E12. Now the E12 didn't replace the E3, of course. The E12 was introduced in 1972.
Yeah.
But BMW Motorsport started to look at the E12 and sort of say, right, what could we do with this? And then before you know it, you've got the M535i.
Yes.
But I do think that the 3-litre SI paved the way for the M535i, which then brings us on to the E28 M5 and the many, many generations of M5 that we've seen since.
So the genesis of the super saloon.
I absolutely think so. And again, I go back to 1971. If you were looking for a performance saloon car in the UK, again, the Rover P6 V8 used by police forces all over the country. And a powerful car, sort of very well built and everything else. But you place a 3-litre SI alongside a Rover P6 V8 and there is no comparison. Again, 200 brake horsepower, electronic fuel injected 3-litre straight six.
Yeah.
There's just no comparison between the two. So you've got that continent crushing ability that we talked about.
Yeah.
On top of being a very sort of sporty car to drive. You'll remember as well that those police forces in the UK that started buying E3s.
Yeah, didn't the Hampshire, was it Hampshire?
Yeah, and the Mets, and the Mets as well, because again, there were very few cars that could, carry the sort of capacity that police forces needed in terms of the police officers themselves, with all their equipment and everything else, but had the power and the speed to, keep up with bad guys.
Keep up with the bad guys, yeah. So having an E3 automatically makes you a good guy.
Well,
that's
a brilliant way to finish, but I'd agree with you there.
Yeah, no, it's been a fantastic interview. Thank you,
a real
Tony.
pleasure, Steve.
Yeah,
Thank
as
you.
always,
Pleasure.
I really appreciate your time.
No,
so there we
pleasure.
go. Hope that was enlightening for everyone on the E3s.